You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You can find all of your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You can find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. And for this very special podcast, we have a new sponsor, Hathaway Strategies. Hathaway Strategies is an innovative grassroots public affairs consulting firm. Based in Indianapolis, Indiana, the team at Hathaway Strategies draws upon decades of experience on the federal, state, and local levels to help companies, candidates, and campaigns achieve their unique corporate or political goals. And I believe that not only does everyone on the podcast today know everyone at Hathaway Strategies, but you've all worked together many, many times. The subject of today's podcast is the historic and victorious 106-day campaign of then Lieutenant Governor Eric Holcomb in November that culminated on November 8th, 2016 with his election as governor of the state of Indiana. And he's doing a damn good job in incredibly difficult circumstances. But today's conversation is about the campaign, and we have current Indiana Republican Party Chairman Kyle Hupfer. We have probably one of my favorite PR folks and Chicago Cubs devotee, Pete Seat, sometimes co-host of the Leaders and Legends podcast, and one of my current bosses, Mike O'Brien, who served as the campaign manager, if I got that title right, Mike, for Eric Holcomb's campaign in 2016. Thank you all very much for joining.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Briefly, I'm going to go through and have each one of you kind of tell me expand on what your roles were in the campaign, and take a minute and talk about how long you've known Eric and how you've met. Chairman Hupfer, we'll start with you.
Well, I've known Eric for a long time. Our sort of friendship dates back to the pre-Mitch days of being a couple of the first people out on the road, campaigning for Mitch, even before Mitch was campaigning for himself. And then obviously throughout that entire campaign, we worked together at the in Governor Daniels' first administration. When he decided he was going to run for U.S. Senate, I was his treasurer and, raised most of his money for that, and then stayed on as that role as treasurer in the lieutenant governor's race that then morphed into a governor's race. So it was always sort of on that side, on the money side of the campaign, but then was just involved in various sundry tasks as assigned, whether it was, kind of spearheading the effort at the state committee to I was a member of the state committee as the 5th district chairman, so spearheaded that effort to, get Eric on the ballot. When Vice President Pence was removed from the ballot to become the vice presidential nominee, we had to get a new candidate on the ballot. So worked with the committee there, and then did various tasks along the way, lieutenant governor search, various other things throughout the campaign.
Pete?
So I first became acquainted with Eric when it was after I left Washington working at the White House, came back home to Indiana, and I wrote a column about Mitch Daniels potentially running for president and the reasons why he should run for president. And of course, this crossed Eric Holcomb's desk, who was deputy chief of staff to Mitch at the time, and he sent me an unsolicited email saying, "Hey, you and I need to talk." So I happened to be in Indianapolis several weeks later for an Indiana Federation of Republican Women event I was speaking at, and had the opportunity to meet with Eric and chat about the column and what he was doing and what he might be doing down the road. And as we all know on this podcast today, Eric is really good at keeping in touch with people once he makes that initial outreach or has that initial interaction. So we kept in touch over the years. And, flash forward, I've served alongside him as a communications director in 5 different capacities. I was his communications director at the Indiana Republican Party when he was chairman, and then on his U.S. Senate campaign, and then on the lieutenant governor's campaign when he became lieutenant governor, then for the campaign we're talking about today, the 2016 106-day campaign. And then for the beginning months of the reelection effort before leaving state party in the campaign last year. So been around him for a long time, helping communicate that message.
Michael?
Well, I think being campaign manager for his gubernatorial race was the first time I ever worked for Eric Holcomb and I had a title and got a paycheck. So my experience with Eric was a lot like Kyle's, where you just kind of got drafted to, help out and pick up a project here and there and just kind of work around him with whatever he was doing, whether it was run Mitch's reelection in 2008 or as state chairman or working for Coates or any of the things that he did prior to that. I met him the first time I really met him and got to know him. We shared an office in the basement of the State House in Mitch's first term. He and I were one of the kind of the 10 or 15 kind of first people that got hired to work in the governor's office when Mitch got elected in 2004. So I was kind of a day one guy with that group. And he and I shared an office in the basement. I was doing legislative and he was doing kind of external coalition building and things that supported the legislative effort and the agenda that Mitch had. But I really got to know him well and worked closely with him when I left the governor's office. And he soon after transitioned out to run the reelect. And I just worked around that. I didn't have an official role in any of that, but I was one of those deals where you're kind of in the office every day doing whatever comes up. And we just stayed close for a long time. And when 16 came around and he became lieutenant governor, and then a few months later, there was the opening on the ballot and Pence got picked up, as Kyle described. Kyle really deserves the credit for running that effort of actually getting that done and getting Eric selected as a candidate. We all kind of picked up the phone and called the state committee members we knew and worked that list, but the organizational side of it and getting that done was all Kyle. And then I got really involved soon after that. On July 27th, Eric asked me to run the campaign, and by August 2nd, I think that was the first day we were all in the office, and the new senior team was in. Marty Obst and the senior team with Pence were on an airplane flying all over the country, and we had a big job to do here.
To any of you, had Eric, when you first met him in the Daniels administration, or as Kyle was saying, the pre-Daniels administration, had he expressed an interest in being an elected official? Or, I mean, some people like to be elected and some people like to, help wield power and get people elected. Mike, to you first. Is that something he had said when you first met him?
No, I mean, he wasn't one of these guys that was always, trying to move up the ladder and gunning for an elected position. He was always a guy that was focused first on trying to be helpful in the moment, whatever that role looked like. Whether it was, he saw before Mitch did, he saw the need for real leadership in the governor's office and for an unconventional way to do that and come about it. And he was the first guy that, was in Mitch's ear on coming back and running for governor when Mitch was out in DC and running OMB. And you kind of carry that through his entire career. I mean, he clearly moved up in the ranks of the party, ran the party and ran Senator Coates' operation, and then ran for the U.S. Senate himself, and really saw a way to serve there until Sue Ellspermann went and became the president of Ivy Tech, and it created an opportunity there. And he was the right guy at the right time to step in and balance, bring balance to that ticket for Mike Pence. So it was never about kind of gunning for the top job. It was about doing what you're charged to do well and hoping another opportunity opens itself up down the line. And it clearly did. And all that goodwill he had accumulated over the years from at the county party level. And, one of the reasons the state committee vote turned out the way it did is because he was the one who put a lot of those people in place or got them their start in Republican politics. And, so all that goodwill came back for him right, at the right time, and was critical for us in that 106-day campaign.
Kyle, when you and Eric were traveling the state or having conversations about Mitch Daniels and his run, and then, through the administration, we should note that Kyle served as director of the Department of Natural Resources. So Kyle was in the Daniels administration as well. Is running for office something that you guys talked about together?
Well, I mean, you go back to, I think he came back from the Navy and, went back to his roots in Knox County and did do an early run for office at the State House. It kind of been
right
by some locals and been involved with a number of other campaigns down there, locally. And so he certainly was pulled to public service and making a difference in things. But I would share that I don't think that Eric really lives his life or has lived his life being around him of trying to think about what's next. He's tried to do the best he can possibly do and what he's doing in the moment. If anything, he's a little superstitious about it. I mean, he doesn't like to put the cart before the horse, like do the job we're doing today. And when we're accomplished with that, it actually, I think Mike can attest to this. Sometimes it makes it hard when you're, trying to strategically plan. It ends up being that you just got to go out and do, you just got to go out and do things and then tell him later that you've done them on his behalf because he wants to be really focused on the task at hand that's in front of him. So I don't think it's something that he ever sat around and said, I'm going to be, I want to someday be the governor of the state. I think when, we'd gotten really close to Dan Coates, he'd spent a lot of time in that office. And so I think really when Dan decided not to run was probably the first time in a long time that it really triggered in him the thought and the desire to step up and actually serve himself in an elected capacity.
Pete, when you were working on the Senate campaign or when Eric Holcomb says, hey, I want to run for Senate, were you surprised by that or did it seem a natural transition?
I wasn't. I mean, there were some beating around the bush comments leading up to that day when we would meet and chat at the Columbia Club, but I'm going to save most of those for my next book and just kind of reinforce what Mike and Kyle have said. And Eric Holcomb is fully and entirely focused on the task at hand at all times. And you would see this in every role he played. There are some people who occupy different positions and they're afraid of executing the job in that position because they're looking down the road to what's next. For instance, when he was state party chairman, and I use this example with people all the time, like when he was state party chairman, he didn't shy from holding Democrats accountable because that was his job. That's what he signed up to do. He wasn't looking down the field to what may or may not happen and how he should conduct himself in that role for some eventuality or some hypothetical. And I think that's why he's such an appealing person in the very many capacities and the very many hats that he's worn over the years. And it even drills down further to just his personal interactions. When he's talking to someone at a reception or an event, he's not looking over their shoulder to see who else is there. He's fully focused in the moment at present with who he's talking to. But I would say, segueing to the 2016 campaign, yes, it was unprecedented. Yes, it was unpredictable, but Eric Holcomb was not unprepared. In fact, I think he was better prepared than many of our modern governors for the role, having been at the side of Mitch Daniels in an official capacity and on the campaign, having been at the side of Dan Coats, incredible public servants that he could learn from firsthand, and dating even further back to John Hosteller, who he worked for when John was a member of Congress. So that, coupled with the deep, meaningful relationships that he built across the state, all of that collided together for what was really a magical and historical moment.
Yeah, I mean, like to the plan ahead part, there would maybe only rivaled by 2020, right? We haven't seen any one of the things that happened politically that happened in 2016. A city lieutenant governor stepping down, Evan Bayh taking Barron Hill off the ticket. You know, Barron, a major party candidate in the summer, stepping off the ticket. A sitting governor who's running for re-election being picked up as vice president, having no candidate for governor or lieutenant governor in that moment. You know, with 4 months to go in late summer, if any one of those things happens in another election year, it's the big story, and all of them happened in like 5 months. You know, so Eric's experience in kind of rolling with it and being in all these different experiences in politics, you didn't know what was going to happen next, so you couldn't plan to tomorrow. You just had to focus on what you were doing today.
I mean, you got to figure, I just added that, Mike, we were at a point in late July where we had no candidate for governor, lieutenant governor, or 2 congressional districts.
Right. I mean, so much happened, you forget about it, and it was major stuff. We had 3 auditors that year, for Christ's sake.
State auditors. Yes, that's exactly right.
Right.
On March 3rd, 2016, Eric Holcomb was sworn in as lieutenant governor. Maybe Kyle, go with you first. You're probably talking to him all the time. Well, all of you were, but how did Eric feel about receiving the nomination or the selection of being lieutenant governor, which clearly was the springboard for his gubernatorial run just 6 months later?
You have to put it in the frame of reference that, you know, there was no gubernatorial run on the horizon at that point. So, you know, it was a really tough time insofar as he had invested a significant amount of effort in building up what I believe was the strongest grassroots network of the 3 then Senate candidates, had well positioned himself in a number of ways for that role. And it was, you know, while that opportunity that he certainly needed to heed the call to take of being lieutenant governor, you don't turn that down when you're asked, especially not when you have a servant's mentality like Governor Holcomb does. But it was really tough to step out of that Senate race. Again, nowhere on the horizon was anything other than, okay, we're now going to be in this lieutenant governor's race. We need to put together the infrastructure to go out and raise money to support Mike Pence. We need to put together a travel schedule to go out and support Mike Pence. We need to do all of these things to ensure that we're reelected. And again, that ticket was in good shape. I mean, there was never a poll that we saw that had Mike Pence down. So he was really focused on that. But the hard part was stepping out of a race that he'd invested a lot of time and energy and sweat into.
Pete?
Well, you go back to stepping out of that race. You know, we ran that Senate campaign out of Hathaway Strategies, sponsor of today's podcast. I was working at Hathaway Strategies at the time. And in fact, I think I wrote that description you read at the beginning of the show. Glad they're still using it.
I'll give you a cut.
Yeah, thanks. So we were there one day. I remember getting a call from a reporter in DC on the date of the deadline to withdraw candidacy. And they said, hey, we hear Holcomb is pulled out of the Senate race. And I was like, what are you talking about? Where are you getting that from? And I was completely in the dark, had no idea what was going on. I called Eric, no answer. Called Justin Garrett, who was the campaign manager at the time on the Senate campaign, no answer. And it wasn't for a couple hours later that Eric arrived at Hathaway Strategies. We all huddled together in Anne Hathaway's office. Eric sat down and he simply said, "We have a new assignment." And he kind of ran us through what had happened over the weeks leading up to that decision and what was going to take place in the weeks following. But I remember around the time he was announced as the LG pick, or after he was sworn in, I can't recall precisely when, but he did an interview on WIBC. And prior to that interview, we were prepping next door at South Bend Chocolate, and this is meant as no slight. It was said for effect, but I looked at Eric and I said, "I think you would have made a really good senator." And he just, kind of, you've seen him cock his head before when, you say something that kind of intrigues him. So, "But I think you're going to be a great lieutenant governor." And the reason I say that is because you just have this infectious passion for all things Indiana. And not that can't be channeled into being a U.S. senator, and we'll see what happens down the road. But I think that role and the role that he currently occupies were made for him, because he truly does love every highway and byway and gravel road of this state.
Restaurant.
I mean, you see it if you're on the Holcomb campaign email list. If you're not, you should get on. But they're sending out lists of his favorite places to get hamburgers and breaded tenderloins and ice cream and all these different foods. And it's not being made up by Kyle and the team at State Party and the campaign. This is all coming from Eric. He literally has a list on his iPad that he tracks this stuff.
Well, remember, Pete, I sent you a text at one point saying, you guys should put out a cookbook or a restaurant guide or something. And you immediately texted back, say, "That's no joke. What do you want? You want milkshake? You want tenderloin? You want a hamburger? We've got it all." And I kind of laughed. I was like, well, hell, I guess they're way ahead of me as usual.
Yeah, we're usually about 6 steps ahead, but but no, and he's got it all because he knows it all. He knows every state, and it's why he is so successful and so popular as our governor, is because he loves the state and he loves the people so much.
Sometimes when I occupy the Michael Bryan chair at Indiana Week in Review and fulfill his duties poorly, I make the point, and have made the point on this podcast. I can't imagine there is or has been a gubernatorial candidate in Indiana's history who had traveled the state more prior to his campaign than Eric Holcomb. He did it when he worked for Mitch Daniels. He did it when he was Indiana Republican Party chairman. He did it when he was district director for Coates. And he probably did it more times than we can count just for fun. Mike, am I off base on that?
No, not at all. And it was first of all, Ann Delaney hates you. I've developed a pretty good relationship with her, but she does not like you at all. So,
well, O'Brien, I'm one of your consultants. You don't have to compliment me like that. You don't have to say nice things.
No, I mean, we had the really good problem we had when all this went down, and we're in August of 2016 trying to get the campaign off the ground and organized. The best problem we had was we had so many people that wanted to help because he knew so many people. A bad problem we had was everyone had his cell phone number. They wanted him at every county, GOP, that's still the case, right? I'm sure Kyle's dealing with this constantly of there's probably never been a governor in Indiana's modern history who more people have his cell phone number and just talk to him directly, which makes it really hard. And to Pete's point, he loves Indiana. August is also the start of the state fair, and all these festivals, county festivals and small town festivals all over Indiana. And you really had one problem we had was we had to prioritize what we were doing. We had no time, right? So he couldn't spend 3 weeks at the state fair, even though he loves the state fair and people from all over the state come. It was we got to get him on the road into big places where he might not win. And invest that time in strategically in places, but people are blowing up his phone, wanting him to show up at Bacon Fest, and which we did. It's well, we don't have time to go to Bacon Fest. We only have 75 days left. We're trying to. We've got a candidate who's been a candidate for 20 of them. So
yeah. And at the same time, we had you know, the governor, Vice President Pence, was on his campaign duties. So it was coming from all angles because every day there'd also be 3 or 4 requests of things that he had to pick up to do for the governor because the governor wasn't here. He had
Right.
duties as lieutenant governor that he'd already committed to. Plus, he had to try to fit in the campaign. Campaign oftentimes was certainly the bottom rung of those rankings, unfortunately.
Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests today are Kyle Hupfer, Michael O'Brien, Pete Seat. We are discussing the 106-day campaign of Eric Holcomb for governor in 2016. We've learned a lot, including that Ann Delaney doesn't like me. And as we head into the summer, speculation is rampant that Mike Pence is on the short list of then nominee Donald Trump's list of vice presidential possibilities. How much credence did you all give those rumors, and how surprised were you, if at all, or maybe even throw Eric's thoughts in here to the extent you know them? On July 15th, 2016, Donald Trump announced that Mike Pence would be his running mate. Shocked? Surprised? What did Governor Holcomb say?
I mean, by then we weren't shocked and surprised, but, I don't know that we were putting a lot of credence into it early. Mike had supported Ted Cruz, as you recall, in the primary. So that didn't really seem to be a necessarily alignment, but he did, check a lot of boxes for the president as far as getting him on the ticket. So that was an opening there, but, kind of, I'd say maybe the 5 to 7 before it actually was announced. It started to look more and more like it was a possibility, so much so that, we were, in my head, and again, he wasn't there, but I was starting to think about what are the next steps. You were, the calendar was just incredibly unfriendly to this process by then. We were quickly approaching, as you recall, we were quickly approaching the date that the deadline to voluntarily withdraw from the ballot. I mean, that really is what put the question to the president ultimately onto whether or not he was going to pick Mike Pence. That was the deadline that was coming. If you recall, once that happened, we were down to, I believe, less than 24 to 36 hours to take Eric off of the ballot as lieutenant governor, and then apply for the caucus. Same thing that Congressman Rakita and Congressman Brooks had to do, and for Governor Pence to pull off the ballot. I mean, it was a really tight timeline. And then obviously the timelines from there didn't get any better to hold the caucus, et cetera. But we knew that timeline was coming. And so we knew the decision had to be made if it was going to be Governor Pence one way or the other within a 3-day period at one point.
Pete, let me ask you a question as to the chairman's point. As the chatter started to pick up, as it started to seem like this isn't pie in the sky, this is a real possibility. And how did you all, as friends of Eric and supporters, did you among yourselves start saying, okay, look, if Pence gets selected, we have to be ready to go? Or was it one of those things, to the point made earlier about being superstitious, we're not going to talk to the lieutenant governor about this until it's time?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. The first time the idea that Mike Pence could be the VP nominee came to my attention was actually several weeks before it became public in an Indianapolis Star story. I remember sitting down watching Meet the Press, and I was watching it on my DVR, and I looked down at my phone because it flashed, and it was a text from Chuck Todd, the host of Meet the Press. And I was like, okay, that's freakish. And I checked the text, and he said, hey, I'm hearing Pence is not just on the short list. I hear he is the list. And I'm like, Chuck, I don't know, man. Like, he's like, what are you hearing? What's the chatter back in Indiana? And I was like, there's really no chatter. I mean, he's running for governor. He's in a competitive race. Chuck's like, well, I'm just telling you, like, this is going down. This is happening. You know, y'all need to buckle up. And I shared that with Eric. I think I took a screenshot of it and sent it to him and was like, hey, just heads up. I don't know what to make of this, but here's what Chuck is telling me. And that was really the extent of the conversation, because going back to what Kyle said earlier, you know enough about Eric to know that he doesn't put the cart before the horse. He doesn't get ahead of himself. Thankfully, he does surround himself, however, with good people who can think through these things and prepare him for what may come. And you know, just to kind of highlight the superstitious aspect of it. I mean, I remember sitting in Eric's basement getting ready to watch the announcement, the actual official announcement that Mike Pence was the pick. And I think we had MSNBC on or NBC, and Brian Williams came up and said, hey, we've just found out that it's actually being delayed. And that's a moment where you're like, okay, what's going on now? Like, you know, kind of pump the brakes a little bit. Maybe we're going too fast here. I mean, it's moments like that that truly made it an unpredictable environment. But, you know, once the chatter really started to pick up and it became obvious that, you know, it was going to be him or Newt or Chris Christie, you know, all the pieces kind of started to get put into place. Because as Kyle said, I mean, the timeline was unforgiving in every way, shape, and form, and there was no time to dawdle and wait.
Was it an advantage? One more question to you real quick, Pete. Eric Holcomb and Mike Pence have probably known each other decades. I'm assuming 20, 30 years. I'm guessing here, but it's got to be a very, very long time given how long Eric's been involved in politics, let alone now Vice President Pence. Did they have the kind of relationship where they could share, you know, information and they felt comfortable talking to each other about this sort of thing? I mean, I can't imagine, I'm going to make a guess here, that Holcomb was in the complete dark like the rest of us or most of us as to what's going on. Did the fact that they got along so well and known each other so well, was that helpful?
I'm going to be a good spokesperson and say I'm not going to speak for the governor on this, but I will say they have, in fact, known each other for decades. And when Eric was a student at Hanover, where Mike Pence also attended, however, before Eric invited Mike to come speak at a fraternity function. So this dates pre-politics. I mean, they had a relationship before Eric was involved in politics, before Mike had run for office. So yeah, and that's a relationship that continues to this day. I don't know how often they talk, but you know, once a friend, always a friend, no matter what role you're playing.
Mike, how quickly after the announcement that Pence was going to join the national ticket, did then Lieutenant Governor Holcomb call you and say, all right, I've made up my mind, I'm running for this? Because it's not a foregone conclusion that he was going to run for it. He could have either stayed as LG or he could have gotten out of politics entirely. When did you get that call, and what was that call like, to the extent that you can relay?
I don't remember, actually. I remember vividly after he was selected by state committee, that entire day. I remember that entire day. I remember going to his house. I remember the troopers there were scrambling, trying to. They said, you're staying home, right? Because they've got to run down to the residence, and because they're still working to secure the residence for the vice president, working with Secret Service, and so it was just chaotic. And I remember being at his house and him and the troopers coming in and going, hey, we're going downtown. We'll leave, but you're staying here, right? Meaning his house. And he goes, yeah, I'll stay here. And then they left, and he goes, all right, let's go get something to eat. So we jumped in his truck and immediately went to a restaurant. So I remember that whole thing. We talked about the campaign, and we talked about what all this is going to look like and the strategy there. And I remember that vividly. I don't remember because there was so much going on. And I was in Boston for a wedding actually that weekend when by the time, I can't remember what day of the week that President Trump, then candidate Trump, announced that he was going to make his selection, and then it got delayed, and it got delayed, if you recall, to 11 a.m. on Friday morning, which was 1 hour before what Kyle just talked about, which was the Indiana deadline to take candidates off the ballot. We had to go through that whole process, and that's when those of us who weren't in, and I wasn't in that tight. I mean, I wasn't in that 5-person circle that was around Pence. I was a layer 2 outside of it, so I didn't know that the decision was official. But everybody, those of us who knew that factoid, at least, and there were plenty of us knew at that moment that that's when the Pence was going to be the pick, and that's when it was going to be announced. And so this other process had to be thought through and put in motion on the time frame. But it was so many things. I don't remember we were talking all the time, so I don't remember having one conversation. But I remember 2 weeks later when state committee voted on July 26th. I remember that conversation like it just happened.
But you weren't surprised when he decided to run for governor. Like, it wasn't like, oh, this is a kind of a, I didn't have any idea you wanted to be governor. But so nothing about the actual desire to run, even in
by then there was no time to pray on it. Like you're in or you're not, and we're going, right? I mean, it's like, that was it. There was no time to hem and haw about it.
Kyle, talk a little bit about, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I can share I've told this story a few times, I think, probably not as publicly as this, but, there was prior to Pence being named, there was probably, like a 7-day, at least 8-day, early July ambiguous period. And I don't remember the exact, all of the words of the conversation, but I do remember when I said, to him, I understand that you are going to remain focused on being lieutenant governor and nothing else until an official decision is made. But I'm letting you know that I'm going to start making calls to state committee on your behalf, because if this goes down, we need to start positioning this now.
Well, the other candidates were already doing that. We knew that.
Other candidates were making calls.
He couldn't sit still.
And we couldn't just sit on the sideline. We had to start building those relationships and putting that out there.
Kyle, talk a little bit, because not that everybody on the podcast doesn't know, but you probably know as well or better than anyone. So now there's a vacancy at the top of the Republican ticket for governor, which then Eric, if he fills, now there's another vacancy, as you articulated earlier. But tell the listeners of the Leaders and Legends podcast, how do you fill this vacancy for governor? What's the intra-party mechanism to make this happen?
Sure. So the folks who were interested had to file paperwork with the state committee to make that replacement onto the ballot. And then it's just a straight up vote of the state committee. Like any other caucus, you've got to get 50% plus one of the votes. It's only the elected members of the state committee. So the chair, vice chair, others weren't involved in the vote. And we sat in a room, the 18 of us, and we cast our ballots. Now, leading up to that was a whole lot of, calls. I ended up not going to the national convention, which was, kind of in that interim period, because I was back here working on stuff for the governor. But, there was a lot of politicking going on at the national convention because a lot of the state committee members were there. And then, we had a pretty good count. There were a few other people who thought about getting into the caucus that didn't. I felt like we had the best count as to where things were at. We were pretty transparent about it, but I can still remember the phone call when we had a group of a handful of people that we kind of deputized to talk to the state committee. Jamie Knoll, as was mentioned earlier, myself, were doing a lot of it. Other people who had good relationships with one-offs got assigned to kind of touch them. And then we were having a call every night leading up to the caucus. I can remember when I finally told everybody, okay, we've got to stop calling them. Like we're going to lose votes. We're going to have never been this communicated with in their life. They've never had this kind of an important task in their life. And so we shut it down about 48 hours in advance, 24 hours before. Jamie and I called through again. And then, we went in and had the ballot.
Now, you mentioned 18 members, so there's a chair and vice chair for each congressional district. That's how you get to 18. The
correct
chairman of the party at the time was Jeff Cardwell. As you mentioned, he did not have a vote, neither did the vice chair. So is my memory correct in that, Kyle, both you and Michael, were you in the room for the votes?
I was.
Well, Kyle was a member of state committee.
Yeah, Mike
Right.
wasn't on state committee then.
So he wasn't part of the 18-member group.
No.
I was county chairman. I was Hendricks County.
Oh, that's
chairman at
right.
the
You're
time,
county
but-
chairman.
Yeah. But I
What do
wasn't
you?
a state committee member. I was in my office at that point. I was at Barnes and Thornburg, and I was in my office wearing a hole in the rug, walking, pacing back and forth so much, texting Joe Elster every 6 seconds what was going on.
What was, because all of you made calls and talked to folks. What was your best one or two talking points? Mike, we'll start with you on Eric's behalf.
Yeah, I mean, so this every caucus, if you've ever been a part of you're a precinct committeeman, listen to this, or you're county chairman or state chairman, whether you're caucusing to select a candidate for governor or caucusing to fill a replacement on the township board, the dynamics are very similar. I mean, the commitments are for your close friends. You get hard commitments immediately, right? Like no one had to convince Kyle Hupfer, at the time, district chairman, to vote for Eric, right?
Right.
But it was, I mean, you had Susan Brooks, and you had Todd Rakita, you had known people. I mean, you had Rakita who had run through that group several times through conventions and party primaries. So he was well known in that group. Susan Brooks, a little less so. She was a congresswoman that she had never, I don't think, established herself kind of on a statewide level. But Eric had. And so I mentioned earlier that a lot of those people were in the positions they were in because when he was state chairman, he got them there. They ran for district chair and he supported them, or he got them involved in the campaign somewhere. And so the reason he is so good at this, and the reason he came out of that caucus successfully, is because he can drive through any small town or big city or county in the state and know the top three people he's supposed to call. I mean, have their cell phone number. He's driving through Hendricks County, he's going to know what county commissioner to call. And that all benefited him and in that process. So he wasn't a guy that we had to introduce to people. He was a little bit of a guy we had to convince would be a great candidate for governor. And he hadn't done that before, and that was a challenge.
Who got to be the one to call him and say, "Congratulations, you're the nominee"?
We were actually sitting
They were at state committee.
Yeah, we were sitting in the conference room at Lou Gehrig's office there in 101 West Ohio, which is the same building as the State Republican Party. A number of us were in the conference room, as was Eric, getting updates from Jamie and from Kyle about what was happening upstairs. And one of those updates came down that he was the guy, and it was time to go up and do the press conference.
Yeah, we were texting. It wasn't calling.
Yeah,
But
Know how to text?
To add on to what Mike said, I mean, I would say that the biggest pitch that I made, I mean, you have to realize, and Mike sort of alluded to this, that who would be the best governor was never really isn't really the measuring stick in most of these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more of a personal when you're in a caucus like this, and oftentimes what's best for me, right, for these individuals. And so that was my biggest selling point was, Eric's going to travel the state. Eric's going to be here for your, pork dinner, your chicken fry, your bacon fry. He's going to be there to help you and your folks in your district and your county chairs and your county commissioners and on down ballot if he's elected. And that's what he's done. I mean, if you talked about somebody who's traveled tirelessly before they were elected, you're not going to find a governor who's done more of those things since he's been governor than he has. I mean, still hitting the festivals, the fairs, the local political, I think he's done, 18 to 20 Lincoln Day dinners each year. I mean, he has stayed very politically active and fulfilled his commitment that he would be very much a grassroots governor.
And Kyle, as the person in the room in this group, to the extent that you want to, and you don't have to, what were the points made against him? Like you thought, well, as we go in, I mean, Kyle's an attorney, so you go in and you make your argument. You had to anticipate arguments made against Eric's candidacy, not against Eric, but against his candidacy? I assume it's got to be that he had never run and won elected
Biggest
office.
one was fundraising. Folks said he couldn't fundraise. Obviously, the $8 million we finished the last quarter with would suggest that was an erroneous. That was an erroneous attack. But that was probably
not,
the big.
Not at the time. I don't want to bang on the guy, but not at the time. It was an erroneous attack. He hated it. He was terrible at it. But he got good. I mean, because he had to do it, and he's excellent at it now.
Well, he's so personable. It's got to be just hugely effective when you're. Of course, Greg Ballard's incredibly personable, and fundraising isn't something he particularly enjoys.
Some guys don't like it. Depends on the master.
So he comes out, and it's Eric Holcomb. How quickly did he announce or choose Suzanne Crouch, who I believe was the sitting state auditor, fourth highest elected official? How long before those two made their pairing?
So we left. I had a room over at the Columbia Club that a few of us convened in. We had done as much vetting and background we could do without talking to anyone, because we did not want to actually reach out to anyone in the LG process. And keep in mind, it was a very narrow field by this point, because if you were on the ballot, you were excluded. So you were past that date to come off the ballot. So anybody running, any state rep was off the consideration. Any statewide that was running was off consideration. All the congressionals who were on the ballot were out of consideration. So it's a pretty narrow field that we had to look at. And the time was quick because we had to get the lieutenant governor choice on the timeline. So at a high level, the process was, we left that meeting. I called potential LG candidates. The next morning they were in Indianapolis. If they couldn't come to Indianapolis the next morning, they were off the list. Governor met with folks that day, and this was on a Wednesday. Met with folks on Thursday. He made a phone call on Friday night to who he wanted to select, and Suzanne. And Friday they filed the paperwork. So about a 36-hour process to 48 hours from him being selected to him selecting an LG candidate. And
you mentioned fundraising. I wish every candidate had Suzanne Crouch's fundraising enthusiasm and prowess. She was a terrific choice and has remained a terrific partner. How long did they known each other, and what made then candidate Holcomb, Mike, comfortable with that choice?
Well, she had a lot of experience. She had a lot of experience in the legislature. She was well known around the state because of that. Already, she was then it moved into a vacancy, filled a vacancy for state auditor. Was a statewide elected official, and like Kyle said, the list was really small. I mean, you had half the Senate. If you wanted an elected official, you had a mayor. If you wanted someone with elected experience, you had your options were a mayor or half the state Senate, and everybody else was off the list. Except for the three, Secretary of State, Treasurer, Auditor. So not that you had to have, you had no time to think outside the box. I mean, so you kind of look back and go, well, you could have, looked at the business community or look somewhere else. It's like, no, you need people that you knew could raise money, and Suzanne could do it, that you knew could campaign, and we knew she could, and had experience in the building. Had been vetted. She'd been an elected official for a long time, and you couldn't go outside the box. It takes time to go outside the box. It takes time to get to know people and understand them. And you had all that already with Suzanne.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our special sponsor for this podcast is Hathaway Strategies. Hathaway Strategies played a significant role in Eric's, now Governor Holcomb's, career and campaigns, and we appreciate their support. You've got the ticket, and you know who you're running against. John Gregg ran a campaign, lost to Mike Pence in 2012 for governor, but a longtime Democratic politico, was Speaker of the House. Universally liked, great personality, had a network having run again. What made you all think that Eric Holcomb could beat a seasoned and smart and gregarious candidate like John Gregg? Pete?
Well, number one, he's a Democrat in Indiana. Number two,
he had experience he had experience losing a governor's race.
Yeah, no,
John
you
Gregg
can learn a lot from that, right? I mean, you can learn more from losing than you do from winning.
Sure.
But what made messaging against John Gregg, and not just, you mentioned he's gregarious, he had a great relationship with Eric Holcomb.
Exactly.
Which was an interesting dynamic in and of itself. But, you go back to 2012 when he ran against Mike Pence, John Gregg's first campaign for governor. I was at the Indiana Republican Party at the time and was tasked with putting together the opposition messaging that we were going to use against John Gregg, and it had the opposition book, the old quotes, the votes, the records, everything, and had put together something like 24 press releases and speeches and you name it. For a variety of reasons, only one of those 24 ever saw the light of day. And I kept everything on my laptop just on the off chance that, you never know, there might be an opportunity down the road. Lo and behold, 4 years later, here we find ourselves running against John Gregg yet again. And I literally just changed the date on every one of those press releases and finally got them out out into the bloodstream. So that was easy, and it was helpful that I had done the work 4 years prior, because we obviously needed to get Eric's message out there and talk about building on the momentum of Mitch and Mike. And on that note, the one thing, and Eric really handled it well, but it drove me crazy when he was asked the question, and probably drove him crazy. He was always asked, "Are you more like Mitch or more like Mike?" And obviously the answer is he's Eric, and that it goes back to why he's so successful is because he's true to himself at all times, and he is who he is. He gets excited about things that normal people get excited about, and loves to talk about the Indy 500 ad nauseum and go to these restaurants like we mentioned earlier. So doing his messaging, once we got through the nomination and had the LG picked and like the process was taken care of, we could really hone in on, okay, what's the message now? What are we talking about from a policy perspective? And do that, because the John Gregg stuff had been taken care of 4 years prior.
Pete, do you have any special messaging stories from that campaign? I mean, you've been involved at the White House, multiple campaigns, as I recall. Pete, forgive me, you did the messaging in 2010 for the Coates campaign for Senate that won. Were you on that campaign as well?
I was, yeah.
And so how is Eric as a messenger, and do you have any particular memories of how things went well or how things didn't go well?
It's something that he has absolutely grown into. And, this is someone who prior to being lieutenant governor, of course, he was running for Senate for a period of time, but prior to that was mostly behind the scenes. I mean, even as state party chairman, he'd go do some Lincoln Day dinners or other county events, but he wasn't always the messenger. He's extremely adept and skilled at crafting a message, in large part because it comes from his head in his own words. But he wasn't always the one delivering that message. And I think we've seen, even in his time as governor, how quickly, rapidly he's grown. His level of comfort is certainly noticeable. But, it goes back to kind of the timeline thing. The big challenge that we had, at least that I had from the communication side, was prioritizing. He had to raise money. He had to go to these events. Everyone wanted a piece of him, including the media. I mean, you've been a spokesperson, Robert. When a member of the media calls with a question, more times than not, the spokesperson can handle it in the right circumstances. But this was not a normal circumstance. This was someone who had just been placed on the ballot to run for governor, and every reporter only wanted to talk to Eric Holcomb. Mike, did his fair share of interviews. I did my fair share, but the majority of them had to be Eric for a number of reasons. And how you prioritize those, how you get those on the calendar, how you make them happen on the road in person, was a real challenge for us. Not to mention prepping for debates and all the other things that you have to do and cram into 106 days.
Kyle, you mentioned fundraising earlier as something that was kind of a talking point against Eric. You guys raised a ton of money in a short period of time. It's a remarkable effort. How did it happen?
Well, I mean, it's as simple as 3 letters: RGA, Republican Association. I mean, they stepped up immensely. I've gotten to know them real well. I know Mike worked with them close during the cycle. They are a phenomenal organization. Republican governors across the country are very strong. They've got a tremendous amount of support. They run a very efficient and effective political operation. And so they were blessed to have a substantial amount of funding. And so between folks who had supported Mike and were willing to, write checks to Eric, his own relationships that he had around the state, which provide some support and fundraising. But, the RGA was, 85% of the funding at the end of the day. And it's why that organization exists. It's to ensure that a candidate or these types of situations can be funded in a relatively short order. Because we were still raising money hand to mouth, as Mike will tell you, but it was a different process than what we've seen, say, over the last 3.5, 4 years heading towards a reelect, where it's a methodical process. It was a free-for-all, catch-as-catch-can. Brian McGrath was very involved with that. Mindy Colbert, who still works for us here, was intimately involved. But there were a lot of interesting calls of, we just need you to write a check if you're supportive of the governor, and we don't know when or if you'll ever get to see him.
That's right. Well, what people forget about, coming out of state committee, fundraising was a big thing. How are we going to pay for this? Pence was sitting on $6-7 million. There was an assumption coming out of that whoever the nominee was going to get all this money, was going to go from Pence to that candidate, and that would be used to seed the campaign and just run it. That money was donated for the purpose of electing a Republican governor, and that's what it was going to be used for. What nobody figured out until we were in it was that money couldn't be transferred because of federal campaign finance laws. We had, for the first time, we're testing campaign finance laws that had never been interpreted or tested before. And so we had to refund, or Pence had to go refund all of those donations that were made to him in a certain period of time, within a certain window. He was able to transfer a fraction of that, just over $1 million, to the Holcomb campaign, which was critical at the time. It seeded the campaign in August of that year. But people assumed, including the Democrats, assumed, okay, well, they're about to get a plug of $6-8 million from Pence that never came. He had to go refund the majority of that. And then we had to set up this, imagine, like, if you've ever been on a campaign, you're just, the organization itself, to traditionally raise money, to identify donors, to call them, to do what Kyle just described, try to, get them a meeting or get them an event. We couldn't do any, we had to do that. But the stuff we had to go through first was refund. Pence had to go through, refund all these dollars. And then we had to identify who those donors were that were getting money back and try to go fundraise off them. So it added this layer to it that was really complicated, and baked in this assumption very early on that Democrats, I think, relied on, which was, this campaign is never going to get off the ground. They can never, the huge chunk of Pence money is not coming. Everyone got it wrong, and none of this money is going over. This campaign's kind of dead in the water before it even started. That was the assumption we dealt with in the first 2 weeks of August.
Mike, how much was the thinking at the time, and everyone is on this podcast is seasoned political thinkers and strategists and communicators and fundraisers. Your candidate was all those things, but how much of it was your path or strategy to win tied to how well Trump did in Indiana in 2016?
We knew the whole as we were getting into it. I mean, we could benchmark each of the races in Indiana off of what Trump was doing. But once we got enough data behind it, once we saw enough polls, and where we saw Trump on the top, and then Todd Young with what's the drop off between Trump and Todd Young in the poll? What's the drop off between Todd Young and Eric? And where's the president need to be in order for us to be in that window to win? And I'll get the numbers kind of right. I mean, if Trump was going to win by 10, there was a good chance Todd Young was going to lose. If he won by 13 to 15, everybody's probably in. And if he wins by 20, it's see you in 4 years for reelection. And that's what wound up happening. That was never certain, right? I mean, like you're a week into October, and the tape comes out, and Mike Pence suspends his campaign, and he's back in Indiana, and we don't know what's going to happen next. Republicans are in the tank nationwide. The assumption is that this campaign is over. There's this ridiculous subplot of replacing Trump on the ticket. All of these crazy things that you kind of forget about, because winning is great amnesia for all the chaos and what you thought was going to be a failed campaign. So we were never counting on Trump winning by 20 in Indiana. We were trying to run a campaign that raised awareness and attention to the extent that Eric was in a position that if that wave came, or if it didn't, and he was on the line, that we had done enough to get him across it.
Did the Todd Young, Evan Bayh Senate race affect your race at all?
It really helped that Evan Bayh didn't have one single good day ever in that campaign. It was a mess from the time he had to get up by September. He had to wake up in the morning and wonder how bad his day was going to be by lunch. I mean, he did not have one single good day on that campaign. And Trevor Fowdy, to his credit, and certainly Todd Young, just pounded the guy. And a lot of his wounds early on were self-inflicted of not knowing where he lived and all this other stuff. Lost to history is Trevor Fowdy and I actually discovered the New Jersey condo back in 2010 when Evan Bayh dropped off the ticket. You'll never convince me that wasn't the reason he didn't run for re-election. But that race, but I digress. That race was on the Evan Bayh side was a nightmare. It was because of the candidate. It was supposed to be a savior, and so we were running in some pretty clean air underneath that race.
The debates are always important. They're usually more important for people like us than they are the ordinary voter, because we put so much emphasis on them from a political consultant and messaging standpoint. Pete, what was it like to prepare Eric Holcomb for those debates? I forget. I used to know, and I don't know who was the John Gregg stand-in, but did you feel the debates did?
It was Randy Head.
Was it Randy? The debates did a good job for Eric because it showed that he could stand toe to toe and really introduce himself to the voters who are paying attention?
Yeah. What I remember most about debate prep is the embarrassment of riches that we had in terms of volunteer mental power. Going back to what Mike said earlier about all these people who wanted to help and were contacting Eric. I mean, you had 5 or 6 policy experts on every issue that we needed to cover. Eric, of course, was well versed on a lot of these, but there were some intricacies that he wasn't fully up to speed on, and that we needed to get him up to speed on. Although, Randy Head was the John Gregg stand-in, I don't think he ever got to play John Gregg. We never actually had him do it. Most of our debate prep was conversation, was digesting information, asking questions, having these various experts around the table. One of which is now the Speaker of the House here in Indiana, Todd Houston. Remember, he was there. Poor Randy Head was always there, just itching to get behind that podium. But Eric, when you work with Eric, you know the telltale signs of how he prepares. He takes the glasses off, kind of rubs his eyes, scribbles things on in the margins, writes out his thoughts, because he really does pride himself on putting things in his own words. And you can prep him as much as you want, you could give him as much information as you want, but he's going to find a way to Eric Holcombize it before he goes up there. And I remember, the first debate was in Indianapolis. It was extremely awkward because it was at a school in the middle of the day. And I remember we were, trying to decide how it would play out. Would you have these rhetorical jabs going back and forth between Eric and John Gregg, or because it was predominantly a school-aged audience, would they be on their quote unquote best behavior? It ended up being the latter. Which was,
we got a lot of, I forgot about that because we got criticism after that because people were like, you got to go after John Gregg. And it's like, well, that's easy to say, but you're sitting in front of a bunch of like sixth graders, right?
Like you didn't see the audience in this room.
Yeah, sure.
And so, it was good because it could get Eric behind that podium talking through these questions and answers, but then bad at the same time because we didn't necessarily know what was going to come in the next debate. And I think the next one was Evansville, if I recall correctly. Mike and I flew down there with Eric, spent a couple of days down in Evansville doing some events and prepping for the debate. But I think Eric did an incredible job in these debates, and it contributed to why he was ultimately elected, as well as all the other things that we've talked about today on the show. But he's such a good, solid, quick study. That once he gets up there, he can regurgitate the information and make it resonate with voters.
Kyle, was there a sort of emotional progression or an outlook progression of, okay, we're launched the campaign, even in Indiana, even as a Republican, we're the underdog for the next 106 days, and then things started to brighten and the outlook started to get a little more rosy? Or was there a time where you're like, okay, we're going to win and I'm feeling good about this? Not that you didn't work hard, not that you didn't get your message out or raise money, but was there some sort of fulcrum where the outlook turned very favorable for Eric?
I can't peg a day. I certainly, we didn't have a whole lot of time to think, Robert. Everybody acting, it wasn't, we didn't have a lot of, there wasn't a, for the reelect, we had strategy meetings and things months out and sort of those sorts of things. None of that was happening. We were, making decisions in the moment, living in the moment. I recall that by the time we got to the JW Marriott, I was pretty confident we were going to win that night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember for me, it was, I think the Friday before the election, I went to Huck's office, Matt Huckleby, and I said, I only want bad information. Everyone's giving me good news on record early voter turnout in Republican areas, and all these data points that we tracked were all pointing in the right direction. That was the Friday before the election. At that point, I'm like, I want the bad news to see if we can. And there wasn't any. By then, if there wasn't any, it was like, the entire environment had changed nationally. That was, a week after the FBI report on Hillary Clinton comes back out, and so everyone's re-energized. All of our voters were motivated. There were these absurd assumptions, and this is all because the middle had a problem with Mike Pence at the time. They would make all these assumptions that voters in suburban areas that are traditionally Republican are voting early in record numbers, and that must be because they hate Donald Trump so much. And they'd have all these like three-way analyses on why that wasn't good for Republicans. And my answer was like, look, maybe the easiest analysis is the obvious one, which is if Republicans are in Republican areas are turning out in record numbers early, maybe they're voting Republican. So we can all dissect it on the back end if that actually isn't what's happening and why. But let's just assume that it's good news for Republicans that Republican areas are turning out in record numbers. And that's what happened.
A poll came out just a few weeks before the election, a Monmouth poll. What was the impact? What was in that poll, Mike? And what was the impact of that poll on the campaign?
Well, the impact on the campaign was there wasn't an impact on the campaign. We thought it was a nonsense poll and it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. It had us down 18 points and nothing we ever saw. These national polls came in and they were up and down wildly. They would be up. It would be 15, 20, 30 point swings weeks apart. Whereas our polling was showing very methodically that John Gregg had a ceiling at 44 that he couldn't get above, and we were gaining on it. and that ultimately was the margin and about the margin in the election. So the impact on the campaign itself was negligible. The impact on the people around the campaign was panic. The impact on the State House and the government center was absolute panic. And so there was a period where you had to go and calm people down and go, look, this is slow and steady. This is a football team with 3 plays. We've been running them for 3 months, and we're going to run them until election day.
Pete, what was your impression?
Yeah, I mean, you remember it being an 18-point margin. I thought it was 13, so maybe by next year we'll say it was 25. Who knows?
Right. It was in the teens.
Yeah, I remember when it came out. I was at Acapulco Joe's down here in downtown Indy with Brian McGrath having lunch, and you were on the phone with us. We were trying to think of a response, and your quote that we put out to the media, Mike, was something akin to laughter with words. We knew the methodology was off. We knew their numbers were off. You can only say internal polling so many times. The media desperately wanted a race. But I think the most lasting impact is, that poll kind of became a rallying cry internally and with our allies. And I don't know if this is, if any of us have talked about this publicly before, but shortly after the campaign ended, Joe Elsner sent around an email and said, "Hey, I need everyone's shirt size." And he didn't say why. He just said, it's a surprise. And I think it was probably at the holiday party later that year, Eric gave everyone a Monmouth University sweatshirt as a gift. I mean, it was kind of like, we showed them, not just Monmouth, but all these people who were trying to take us out. The media was trying to wrap their narrative around this poll and say that John Gregg had this in the bag. And we ultimately showed them who's who and what's what.
As we wrap up the Leaders and Legends podcast about the historic 106-day campaign 2016 of now Governor Eric Holcomb, Kyle Hupfer, there's a pejorative term assigned to folks running for office. It's a condition. It may be medical, it may not be, and that condition is candidate-itis. Do you have any examples of Eric Holcomb's candidate-itis that we can smile about years later, or did the fact that he ran Mitch Daniels's 2008 campaign, which amazingly won Marion County the same year that Barack Obama shattered records for votes in Marion County, how much did the fact that Eric had been where Mike was, where you are, help him get past what is a common lament of candidate-itis?
I'm not sure exactly what candidate-itis is. When I think of it, I think of these serial candidates who can't do anything else in their life, which is certainly not Governor Holcomb.
I think it's defined as thin-skinned, anxious, nervous all the time, calling Mike O'Brien multiple times during the day. Am I going to be okay? What should I do? Mike, is this all sounding familiar?
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah. I don't know. I'm sure it's completely his MO. I mean, all of us, at least Mike and I and Eric, to some degree, and probably to a large degree, owe a great deal of our political pedigree to living in and around and soaking up Governor Mitch Daniels, right? We all cut our teeth to some way, shape, or form on that campaign. We were all around him. And let's just say that he has a very unique style as a candidate. Especially with this. And so that what you see a little bit is an opposite approach with Eric. He tends to be very calm, cool, collected. A lot of stuff doesn't bother him. You don't see him overreact to media questions or to some negative piece that is written about him. And I think he keeps his eye on the prize, that he understands that the only real objective is to win on election day when you're a candidate. And I think some of that was also shaped, by his first run for State House. I mean, you and I've talked about it a lot. I mean, I think you learn a lot in that kind of a race when you're not your own person, which, there's certainly things I would do different. I know there's things he would do different from that run. And so you let that shape you, and he's very much his own person and comfortable in his own skin. And so, I guess everybody has a little bit of it, but he's pretty calm under fire.
On November 8th, 2016, Eric Holcomb was elected, I believe, the 51st governor of the state of Indiana, to the everlasting credit of Hoosier voters and to our great benefit, in the sense that we have his steady hand, his calm hand. And quite frankly, I think his military background has helped him considerably navigate what are some unprecedented issues in the history of Indiana. We have 3 guests on to talk about this campaign, and I'm going to ask for their final thoughts. Pete, give me a final thought about that campaign and or Eric Holcomb.
Well, you mentioned Election Day, and the first thought that popped into my mind goes back to the superstition. Is I wrote a victory speech and a concession speech. And to my knowledge, Eric Holcomb did not look at either of those until the race was called. In fact, I remember Mike O'Brien coming down to the ballroom to get copies. I'm pretty sure it was you, Mike. And I accidentally gave him 2 copies of the concession speech. And he called me back and was like, "Hey, try that again." So I had to go back to the printer, print the victory speech. And I always took it as a testament to understanding Eric and knowing how he thinks and how he likes to phrase things, that very few edits were made to that speech. And it stands as one of my proudest accomplishments in politics, is not just being part of this campaign, this historic 106-day campaign, and working with incredible people like those on this show today and those whom we've mentioned, but the idea that I was able to write those words in that night, and that they were delivered to Hoosiers by our next governor.
Mike, I want you to do the same thing, but I want to ask a question, give you an additional assignment, and that is, very quickly, and I meant to ask it earlier, I had it written down, but didn't. Along with your final thoughts, how important Janet Holcomb was to Eric's victory? She understands politics. She understands fundraising. She understands campaigns. What role did she play, along with your final thoughts?
I mean, she was a full partner. I mean, it was, she was on the road every day. She was out, just his other half. And that's what we needed. That's exactly what we needed. And she, you just said it. I mean, she understands politics. She understands how all this works and how it all fits together. And you don't always get that, especially if, when you go home and tell your wife you're going to run for statewide office and starting tomorrow. 3 or 4 months to do it. So she was critical in all that, and has been a great first lady and a great partner to Eric through all this. I mean, the takeaway on election night, or the takeaway on the campaign, first of all, it was an honor to be a part of it, and certainly probably the greatest position in campaign politics I'll ever have. And I do joke it's entirely possible at 36 I peaked. But the team was what really struck me. I mean, we had a core team of 23 people. We had 20 people out in the field, and with the exception of 4 of those of that team of 46 or 47 people, and I said this on election night when I went down and had just told Eric that he won, which was a great moment personally in my life and career. Had the opportunity to tell him and Janet and Dan and Marcia Coates, who were in his room at the time, that the Associated Press had called it. I got up to his room and Pete called me, and I hung up and told him the Associated Press had called the race and congratulations. But I went down and addressed the team in the war room and said, it was never lost on me that entire team had been stepped up and sought that job of whatever job they had in that campaign. They got it to get someone else elected governor, and that person was Mike Pence. And the campaigns are in politics in general and life in general, right? It's full of people competing with each other, positioning each other in politics, and they're trying to be close to the guy, or there's drama on the team, or people want to be the one making the decision, or whatever. There could be a lot of drama in politics, and there was no room, there was no time for that, and there wasn't any. The team we had just reacted to the situation as it unfolded over the summer, and just drove straight through the campaign and never missed a beat. It was a great effort.
Kyle?
I don't know. I just look back and think of it as being a heck of a lot of fun, that to kind of get to be a part of a historic situation, to get to watch one of your friends, go through it as well and become governor. I just always look back at it with a lot of fondness and opportunity, for a lot of folks in this state who had been around politics. This was a little bit of the changing of the guard, some new folks like Mike O'Brien or Brian McGrath or Pete Seat, who, it was a new day and a new group of folks who were running a campaign, running the show, making decisions, having fun, and showing that it can be done in a good and congenial and friendly way. And I that's what I think about. I think about all the good times and fun that we had along the way. Certainly it was hard work, but it always is. But I'm just thrilled to have been a part of it.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel, Grand Hall, and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Special thanks to our sponsor for this podcast, Hathaway Strategies. Our guests have been Kyle Hupfer, Pete Seat, and Michael O'Brien, three men who not only are good friends of mine, for which I'm very grateful, but who played an instrumental role in the election of Eric Holcomb for the 106-day campaign in 2016. Guys, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your insight. Great stories, a lot of fun, wonderful history. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.